While our chart is pretty attractive so far, we don't have labels to let us know what it is we're actually looking at. We can look at the bars and we can intuit that their widths correspond to their numbers, but we don't know what these particular bars stand for. As we've been developing the chart, we know that the y-axis represents different donuts, and the x-axis will represent either quantities or sales or some other kind of number. We'll determine that later. So how do we add axes to the chart? Let's head to the code. What we'll do here is we'll write some code that will allow us to add an x and a y axis to our chart. First thing that we'll do is we'll scroll down and find the line where we added an ordinal color scale, and that's here at line 46. Let's create a new line and type the following: var x-axis equals d3.svg.axis, and then open and close parentheses. The SVG portion of the D3 library has functions and utilities for easily creating SVG elements. As you can probably tell from the axis function of that portion of the library, we will create axes for our chart using this particular function. Now on a new line, we'll determine the scale to be used for our axis, and we'll do that by typing .scale, open and close parentheses, and then we will feed as the argument the scale to use. Since this is the x-axis, we'll use the x scale. Now on another new line, we'll determine how the axis should be oriented on the chart. The way to do that is to type .orient, and then open and close parentheses, and then as a string, the position in terms of top or bottom, left or right. So we want this at the bottom of the chart. And then we'll type a semicolon, and that ends the statement that began at line 47. So to create a y-axis, we'll repeat this. var y-axis equals d3.svg.axis. Open and close parentheses. On a new line, the scale, open and close parentheses, and we'll use the y-scale. Then finally, where we'd like to orient it on our chart. .orient, open and close parentheses, and here we want the y-axis at the left. Save the code, head back to the page and refresh, and no changes have occurred. Well, that's because now we need to call this axis on the chart so that we can display it. So we'll head back to the code and we'll scroll down to where we have created the bars and the labels, and just underneath the creation of the labels, we'll type the following: this.append, and then open parentheses, and pass as a string g. Now the append method takes a selector and will append that element to the DOM. So here, this represents the chart, which is fed in line 99, and that's the case because we're using .call, and .call lets us determine what this represents. So we're appending a group element, and then now we will append the x-axis. Before we do so, let's class this group, .classed, open and close parentheses, and then we will append two classes, x and axis. And we need to make sure we put in the second argument, which is true, so that way it applies to class. Also, since it's a group, we want to make sure that we set the transform attribute, .attr, and then transform as a string, with the second argument being translate. Open a string, translate, open and close parentheses, and within those parentheses, 0, 0. Now eventually we're going to break this up and include some manipulation via code, but right now we'll just keep it as a string. Okay, so now that we have prepared our group with a class of x and axis, and we've prepared the transform attribute, we can call the x-axis so that we can display it. And here's how we do that. On our new line, notice that there's no punctuation after the previous line, .call, and we'll pass in x-axis. And now semicolon. Head to the code and refresh, and now you can see the x-axis, but it's at the top of the screen. And you might be saying to yourself, well, wait a minute, we told it to orient at the bottom. Well, that more has to do with the anchoring of it. We still have to move this, and that's why we introduced the transform attribute. So let's do that now. We'll go back to the code, and so within the transform attribute, we need to affect the translate value. And so we're going to get rid of the zeros and instead open and close strings in their place. And now between, we'll type some plus signs because we're going to do concatenation. Okay, so for the left value, 0, and for the top value, it'll be the height of the chart. Head back to the code and refresh, and now you can see it at the bottom of the chart. We'll adjust the margins for the chart after we're done creating the x and y axes. Now let's create the y-axis. So we'll go to the code and then on a new line, just underneath the creation of the group that holds the x-axis, we'll type the following. This.append G. And so we're appending to the chart a new group. .class y space axis, and then as the second argument, true. We're adding the class y and axis to this group. Now .attr transform, and for the second argument, translate, open and close parentheses, 0, 0 within the parentheses. So we're adding the attribute transform, and we're giving it a value of translate parentheses 0, 0. Now with the group created, we can call the y-axis. And that will take the y-axis as defined and insert it into the group. Go to the code and refresh. And now you can see the y-axis at the left. It's being cut off, so now let's adjust the margins. We'll head back to the code and then scroll to the top. And let's find the margin declaration at line 28. And now we'll affect the bottom by changing it to 40 pixels and the left by changing it to 80. Save and let's refresh in the browser. Now we can actually see our axis labels. Now there is one aspect of this that isn't quite right, and that is the thickness of the lines for the axes. We'll change that by styling them using CSS. Let's head back to the code, and what you'll want to remember is that we applied the class x and axis to the group that's holding the x-axis, and y.axis to the group that's holding the y-axis. Now, what the two axes hold in common is they both have the class axis. So now let's head to main.css, and we'll add some styling for the axis class. At the bottom of the code, we'll add .axis space path, comma, and a new line, .axis space line, open and close curly brackets. So what we're saying here is that any element which is classed as axis that holds within it either a path or a line, we're going to apply the following style. First thing we'll do is we'll set a fill of none. So there will be no fill, that's actually why the line is so dark. And if we save it and head back to the browser and refresh, now it's gotten rid of the thick bar and actually just created another problem. We do need some kind of line. Head back to the CSS. On a new line, we'll set the stroke to be black, which is hashtag 000. Save it. And we'll look at it again and refresh. And there are the lines, but they're kind of blurry. Now we've had this problem before. It's easy to fix with lines. We'll go back to the CSS. And now on a new line, let's copy the shape rendering crisp edges from the bar class and paste it here within the axis class. Paste it and save and refresh. And now we have really crisp lines for our axes, and that's looking pretty good. You can use the SVG portion of the D3 library in order to create axes for your charts. Axes are really important because they give the user a sense of what they're actually looking at with the data. And that way your visualizations can be accurate, clean, and meaningful to understand.